what are good ways of creating indicators and so on, right? So with kind of the second half of today and next week, we are moving into discussions of implementation and monitoring. Okay, so that's where we are. And after that, we'll be spending a few sessions on impact evaluation. Okay. And that's where it can get a little technical, but we are very conscious of the fact that it's a diverse group. But still, you know, when people talk about impact evaluation, what do they mean? What do they do it? What are the claims they make? And things like that. So after today and next week, we'll be moving to impact. And then in the course of doing that, we'll also talk about impact process tracing. I think I had alluded to that briefly last week, which is what are the processes through which impact occurs, right? Not just some numbers, kitna impact hua, 10% improvement in some indicator, but the process part. So all of that we'll be discussing when we get to impact. And following that, we'll spend some time on, you know, analysis and evaluation, data, how to use evaluation findings, things like that. Yeah, because we are now well and truly into, you know, kind of getting to the middle of this course. I just thought, just to make everybody clear. So design, right? Research design, and then a little bit on implementation, but more than on impact. Yeah. And the fourth kind of section of this course is on data analysis, using evaluation results, communicating results, findings, things like that, right? So that's how it's planned. I think, Namrata and Neni, we had, I think, given you a session plan, I think maybe early on. I don't know if that was circulated to others.
Yes.
It might, yeah, it might, if not, yeah, it might be good. Just so that you all also know, you know, sort of where we are in this. Maybe as we begin, let me also say that this course is very deliberately, the series of sessions we're doing is deliberately intended to go through the entire kind of cycle of evaluation, from design to impact to use of evaluation, even though many of you, your own tasks within the organization, maybe particularly in one thing or the other. But so some of these things will resonate directly with what you're doing. But I think the idea of going through this entire set of sessions is also to be exposed to think of other aspects, which if you're in the sector, it's something we need to know, or something you'll be handling at some point. So do remember that. Yeah. So I think at this point now we're getting into part of it, which is more familiar territory in terms of implementation. Right. So that's where we're going today and next week. Yeah. So that's the overall thing. So as we start, any comments or thoughts from last session? I'm going to build off of last session only, but let me just check in with you. I noticed a few of you did upload theories of change. Many of you, I think, were okay with what you had previously. We'll come back to that. The big comment, was about logic model versus theory of change. Remember, right? I think we are used to thinking of the input, output, outcome, categorizing kind of thing, and listing things in each category, which is a good first step. That's the logic model part. But how does one come to the other? What are the assumptions? What are the risks? In translation, that's the slightly less structured area of theory of change. And it's possible, I'm speculating, that some of you are less comfortable with that, right? So if that is the case, think of these sessions focusing on those arrows, right, and those assumptions as slightly pushing at a received way of thinking of theory of change, which is just listing inputs, outputs. So it's not either or. We do that, but we also think of how to connect, how to justify how one thing leads to the other. Yeah. So we discussed all this last time, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves. Okay. So if there are no questions or comments, let me get back to the slides.
One comment to what you said, Suraj, is that I did try to, I realized that what I had done was like a logic model thing. And then, but I had created that framework where the social processes and outcomes were also there, and I completed that.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
felt that managed to do it, the combined thing, but I don't know whether
You did. In fact, you had a nice column where you try to reflect on the social processes connecting with things, right? So it is not diagrammatic, but one
it's
can
not diagrammatic, yeah.
but I could imagine the diagram when I saw that kind of spreadsheet. So yeah. So my request is for others also to start thinking about that. Even if, let us say, donor demands are more of the logic model sort, remember we're also just thinking of how best to legitimize a design in our own eyes, right? Yeah. Okay. So good. Yeah. So I think, Namrata, and at some point, if any of you wants to put up, what you did, we can discuss that. If anybody wants to volunteer for it, part of what you uploaded can be discussed. It might be of help. But let me finish a little bit of material for today, and then we'll see whether that's done. But exactly the point Namrata is raising is going to be my request as an assignment for next week as well. If you haven't gotten down to that arrow business, let's not let it go, because we are still discussing that in this session. So we could still think about it for as continuing that assignment for next week. So I'll come back to that, Namrata. But I think several people are not going beyond that, maybe due to time. But it would be worth discussing, and I'll take a little bit of time later today to ask why. I mean, where are the difficulties, right, in going past a logic model? The kind of discussion we had with the TINP last time, right? It was simple enough. This leads to this, leads to this. But then you start asking on what basis do they think one thing leads to the other, right? And that's really a good thing to try to do. So yeah, and I think Namrata did it in an interesting way. So that might be worth sharing how you did it, which is still in a spreadsheet format, but she managed to put in the processes for each set of activities within that. So it's a nice, interesting way of doing it. So, okay, we'll come back to that. So yeah, I think I need the screen sharing. Yeah. All right. So, this is the kind of, attempt that would be good. This is, as you remember, this was a TINP diagram, right? One is, of course, to identify the inputs, outputs, outcomes. And here, remember, we were distinguishing the activities, which is the things leading to outputs, and the outcomes, which are the processes, right? And that's what I think many of you did in your logic models. And so the next step would be, if possible, to actually put it visually. But even if you don't put it visually, take your logic model and see what arrows you can draw from what you've already got, right? So that was the kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to move on from there. One of the things which is often mentioned in the context of creating theories of change is, somehow I'm not able to see participants when I switch on my slides. Let me just see if I can fix this. Okay. For some reason, I'm only the slides are I'm able to see, not able to see participants, but I'll go on for a while.
You can change by viewing option. You can.
Let me see
on the right side top of your system, you can see the view option, and here the layout is different. So click the layout side by side gallery, then you can see maybe.
Okay. Right. I should click Riti, the gallery option, right? Is
Yeah.
that what you said? Yeah, yeah. It's actually clicked already. So, okay, let me try it again.
Right next to you are viewing Suraj's screen. There's
Yeah.
options, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now it's working. Yeah. So
Okay.
thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah. So this idea, and this is a quote I'll go through from one of the evaluation textbooks, this idea that often theories of change or how we design programs are what is called off the shelf. We sort of have packages, especially if we are in a sector and we do programs and then something else comes up. And many organizations do it. There's tendency to kind of get into off the shelf rather than think from scratch about needs assessment, program choice. Which, by the way, before I read this, was one of the critiques of the TINP. I'd mentioned that one of the critiques by an anthropologist, Devi Sridhar, was that TINP was designed by the World Bank. Now, even though it was in the nutrition and education sector, it was designed by economists at the World Bank with a biomedical perspective. So they did not, therefore, think social structurally about the lives of these women and the difficulty of, getting water and, having a say in the child's nutrition. They didn't think of, gender problems and so on. So in other words, the nature of the people doing the designing really affected how TINP got made. That was one of the critiques that Sridhar made. And I think that's more generally applicable to most of us, right? We focus on a particular way of doing things. And so this danger of, kind of off the shelf. So let me just read this longish quote. The human service professions operate with repertoires of established modes and types of intervention associated with their respective specialty areas. As a result, program design is often principally a matter of configuring a variation of familiar off-the-shelf services into a package that seems appropriate for a social problem without a close analysis of the match between those services and the nature of the problem. Right? Longish, but I think somewhat straightforward claim. And I at least feel this resonates with my limited experience. And I think it might, fit with your experience too. And if a donor says, let's do this also, we add an extra package, right? We do this as well, kind of thing. I'm thinking of my time at Vidya Bhavan. That's the way we often operated for various logistical reasons. It's easier. It's also fits one's ideology. You already got a package, kind of thing. So, not that this is necessarily problematic, but we should be aware of when the dangers of off the shelf. Logistically, we might often have to do it. And that's the danger is what's mentioned in the last part of this quote. Of shelf services into a package that seems appropriate for a social problem without a close analysis of the match between those services and the nature of the problem, right? Which is why a justification in the theory of change will help us get out of this, right? Even if we have that tendency, yeah, we do trainings well, or we do science education well, or whatever it is, an organization has some niche expertise in. The theory of change, those arrows, right? So this a logic model doesn't capture, but trying to explain how what we do leads to other things and other things, right? With an understanding of the context, then becomes important. So this is one way to kind of address this possible danger of what is inevitable with it, which is off-the-shelf kind of packages. Let me also take on this slide, and then if there's any discussion you'd like on this. So the question here, I know this is a slightly busy slide, is why are program assumptions not questioned more often, right? I gave you one example in the context of TINP, which is when they took it to Bangladesh, one of the unquestioned assumptions was that the mother of the infant is the appropriate person to get into the counseling sessions. But it turns out that that was not the case. And so while the counseling sessions were fine, they didn't really address those who had control over decision making about the child's nutrition, because of the nature of family structure and so on in Bangladesh, right? So, so therefore, this question: why are program assumptions not questioned more often? And I think we can all relate to this because of the difficulty of creating a theory of change, right? Only when we create it can we then start asking, oh, is that arrow valid, right? But if we stay in the world of logic model, we conveniently don't address the issue of assumptions at all, right? So there's nothing to question. So in a way, creating a theory of change is making oneself vulnerable because it invites a discussion, right? Because then you're making a claim that this leads to this for such a reason. And then somebody can say, no, my experience is different, or this context makes me think differently, right? It invites that. And by not even going there, we don't even get to this question of questioning program assumption. So here are some possible kind of reasons why we don't do this. And a lot of that has to do with the realities of funding and running programs, which would be familiar to all of you. So let me just go through the points I've got here. Funders emphasize description of activities and expected outcomes. So if funders themselves don't insist on an explanation of why we think things are likely to work, well, sympathetically, I mean, but asking for that, and typically logic models seem to suffice, right? Listing, and then it all becomes, oh, how do you measure the various outputs that you've claimed, and put some targets on it, 80% utilization of something, and then creating big systems to measure it and make sure that you reach that target, right? It goes in that direction rather than asking what is the overall flow, and is that reasonable, right, in terms of design. So that's one. The other is a disconnect between those who plan programs and evaluate programs on the one hand, and those who actually implement. And there's a quote from an article here of a program manager implementer. We are so busy implementing, right? So that disconnect, between so one has to take a step back, right, and have the space to reimagine how a program can work. But if most of the time one is running pillar to post, firefighting, that kind of thing, that's difficult. And this disconnect between planners and implementers. This is not just something in the context of small education or development organizations, but this disconnect is much broader, and a lot has been said for overall, for example, the Indian state, the Indian government. How come, we continue to make, overarching programs without really hearing, from those who do the grassroots implementation, right? So I think there is a huge hierarchy, definitely in the state, but often even in NGOs, which are much smaller. So anyway, so this point about disconnect, I think, could also explain why it's not questioned, because the people who question it typically don't have the power in these hierarchical contexts. Second is implementers don't see it as their job, and they fear that the project will get thwarted, right? If one starts questioning and realizes that nothing is as pakka as a nice, neat logic model will suggest, right? Things are always, but if people are not don't appreciate, that kind of candidness, that slight opening oneself to the vulnerability of getting critiqued, right? Then it's a problem. So I think that fear, again, because of the kind of power relations between donors and organizations, within organizations, between senior designers, junior implementers, those kinds of hierarchies. I'm slightly overgeneralizing here. I'm sure there are good exceptions, and we all try in our organizations. We are aware of these things, and we try in our ways too. But yeah. And so here's a quote. It is dangerous to do one of those logic models after, here what they mean is theory of change, after the grant has been funded. By doing this, you may spot gaps in your original application, and then you worry about telling the program office that you can't do what you said you would. These quotes are, by the way, from NGOs in New York. This particular article is not about the Indian context, but very relevant. I mean, I think these quotes, really pick up also things that we face in Indian education development organizations. So let me pause there. I think there's a lot more we can reflect on, and maybe a few minutes at least. Maybe I should just switch out this, but I mean, would you agree that we don't often enough question program assumptions? First of all, we don't put them out, right, in a flow manner, right, in a theory of change manner, and justify assumptions and justify risks, and bring in context, right? So that the claim is that that's the case, and so question is, why not? And I've offered some reasons, but I think there are many more which we might ourselves have experienced. So maybe a little bit of discussion on this, and this is also part of, and what's the purpose of this kind of discussion? Partly for our own organizational health, right? To be able to craft design better. And the second is to be able to have more healthy conversations with donors who may be less interested or less knowing of the context. Maybe, but how do we move that needle a little bit? Knowing that there are, of course, power relations, there are certain things one can't still do, but how to have those healthy kind of connects, because that previous slide was talking about disconnects, right, between planners and donors and implementers. So that's worth thinking about. And I don't know, what is your own experience in Vikramshila or in the wider sector regarding this? So yeah, I'll just invite any responses. Yeah, please go ahead, Nani.
So, you see, Suraj, in the wider sector and even in Vikramshila, what I've noticed is that sometimes, you see, we do proceed with a certain set of assumptions, but when we look at the data which arrives as a result of our tools, that makes us, think, okay, why did this question not work out? Or why is this data so different from what we thought it would yield? And that is the stage when we actually begin reflecting on our assumptions. And then, yes, by, in the form of explanations, we do tend to highlight those points. But if we, if somebody tells us that we should take that into cognizance right at the beginning of the stage when we are actually devising the tools, it does tend to become a little difficult. But yeah, that is often the stage when I have come across the assumptions being a little bit of, barrier to the project design.
Right. And that is typically, just to understand you better, typically when things don't go well enough, right? Or is it also when things go well? Meaning, is it kind of routine review where you look at assumptions, or is it only when, there's a little bit of, things are not going well, that you're forced? I guess I'm asking, is it a little bit ad hoc, or is it a systematically examining assumptions periodically, right?
Definitely, the need does arise when the data does not really, yield something we wanted it to. But then there are also instances when, say, we are asking a particular question to a respondent, and the responses are only, we only intend to gauge a particular type of response, say category A. But then we also see the respondent responding to categories B, C, D, like a whole new realm opens up. And that is also when it makes us reflect that, okay, this is something, we should have it should have been a part of the project design stage, but it's coming at this stage. So yeah, I think in some cases also it is a little unavoidable. Like, yeah, that is my reflection on that.
My experience, Suraj, and I think Vaishali and Ria and others who work on projects, Namrata, who work on these project documents to submit, the proposals, etc., is that what we find is while the statements that you shared from your previous slide, they spoke about the implementing organization also not being very comfortable responding to these things, but in our case, we also find that the donor organizations are not very comfortable asking for this kind of POCs, because at the person front ending their organization is obviously someone at a junior or a mid senior level who is probably again not adequately capacitated or equipped enough to answer our questions, because we are also not equipped enough to respond to what they're asking. So they probably send out a few documents for us to read. ये है theory of change, ये पढ़ लो, and then you can submit something. But then whatever we submit, they will go around, the means of verification part of it, or जो दिखता है. And again, the systems are such that now everything is on portals, so सब कुछ submit करना होता है. So while they're submitting, they're like, अच्छा, risks and assumptions is left. So last moment we're quickly filling out risks and assumptions, and we're sending it out based on maybe 2 hour processing amongst ourselves. So it's I don't see it's a very well thought out or planned kind of a system as yet, even even among the donor agencies.
Yeah. Also, sometimes, the structure is actually provided by the donor organizations, at the stage when they ask for the proposal of the project. And to fit these assumptions in that structure would actually require us to be a little open-ended, which we want to be. But then that may not, bode well with the donor organization.
Yeah, formats are often very closed, right? And even word limit, I mean, so many characters, I mean, and so so the signals we are getting are also not to think that openly, just to slightly check box kind of thing. So this is the relations with donor agencies. Yeah, that's the kind of larger, I think, issue that especially older, better established organizations like yours should see itself. I don't know how, but that discourse, however it is, that's one thing. But the other is internal to the organization. Even if donors don't require this, right? And internally, you may not have such rigid formats, right? There are informal conversations and so on, which is, I think, Nani's first point, right? Of we do sit and so how does it happen there? And can we embed some of that in design itself? Because after all, you're not doing these programs for the first time. I mean, you've got past programmatic experience. How is that being embedded in the design stage itself, right? Of course, every program will have kind of a review and checking of assumptions, but the start of it presumably could be based on past reviews of other programs, right, of the organization. Maybe it is internalized, but I guess the idea of theory of change is to slightly don't assume it because we've been doing this, so this is a reasonable design, right? I mean, that's inadequate. We still need to spell it out.
Suraj, do you think, I mean, maybe social projects haven't, evolved to a stage? I always, draw a comparison with the corporate world since I come with that experience, that we haven't evolved to a stage where we have standard models or, standard frameworks for implementation. See, because if you look into maybe, civil projects or, even IT projects, they have some standard architecture frameworks. So if you say our design, complies to this framework, number of questions that get raised from, any stakeholder definitely, reduces. Let's say we are compliant to XYZ framework. So we do not have too many standard frameworks specifically for social interventions. Is that a correct statement, or do we have some which I don't know of?
Well, things like the log frame are are meant to be frameworks, right? Yeah. This whole now the question is how narrow and rigid are the frameworks. So frameworks exist. In fact, many organizations peddle their frameworks, right? Everybody has their own tweaked version of a log frame, and there's so many fancy names for these. I think last time I showed you a slide full of different terms, right? Blueprint, this, that. I mean, everybody, but it's some version of what we've discussed in the last two sessions. The question is, when we are dealing with the social world, where an engineering approach is insufficient. We are dealing with people. People can surprise us, and we are dealing with lots of people within our organizations, in communities, in classrooms, and so on. How can we have flexible enough frameworks, right? Contextual enough frameworks. So one, I'm also just slightly thinking aloud here, but one response I have, Seema, would be, it's not that we have not evolved frameworks, but it's the nature of the work we do has to allow for very contextual. And the moment we take an engineering view and make it non-contextual, जो भी है format.
Suraj, I would not say engineering. See, to give you a typical example of, say, State Bank of India, right? A large bank. I mean, no competition across the globe to the customer base that they deal with, right? They also deal with people. Of course, they deal with money from the people, but ultimately it is a very large user base that they have, right? And day in and day out, they have transactions, user interfaces. So they also do a lot of work with people. So to say that, the volume or the people aspect or the perspective is different in social, I would not, I would defer to agree.
This is very interesting. Yeah. This is very interesting. So, and so today,
maybe the stakes are different.
Yeah.
The stakes are different. Volume, I would not, agree.
So this is an important enough point. So what I'll do, and I think we'll have a 5-minute break. I'll fish out something, which I was not planning to do today, which would be worth discussing in the context of what Seema said. So there is a way of thinking about, what is different about and similar between the large scale SBI financial transactions that's, Seema's example is telling, and the kinds of, working with kids, with teachers kind of work, let us say that, right? What is similar and what is different?
Financial transactions, I would say the people, directly working with people, right? SBI say, directly going or reaching out to rural sectors, influencing people to open banking accounts. Somewhere I, draw a parallel there. Okay. I'm not saying financial transactions because that's a totally
raised, Suraj.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Namrata Rawat and Neni, I think, want to say something.
Oh, okay. So especially if it's to Seema, but we'll come back to this point, Seema. Others, either to respond to this or to others. I don't know who's. I see Nani and Namrata both raise their hands. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Namrata, do you want to go ahead or should I ask my question?
You go ahead, please.
Yeah. So, see, the thing is that what Seema ji's comment brought me back to was the desire to have behavioral economics penetrate the realm of financial economics. Like banking sector is moving towards behavioral economics because they do understand that people transactions are quite complicated. And you see, in the social sector, the sectors that we operate in, primarily a structure has to have a lot of flexibility. And that has to come from the donor organization as well. Whether it does or not, that is a practical thing, but it has to come from the implementers as well. And I think in my experience in Vikramshila, the implementers do tend to, just pinpoint towards these, say, anomalies which arise in the field, data which is different, or happenings in the field which are quite different from what we had assumed or presumed before entering the field. But to draw a comparison and desire for a structure in the social sector might not be as effective as it is in the corporate world. That is it.
Yeah, I think you used an interesting term, the nature of the transaction, right? Yeah. So I think as Seema is right, that there are human to human transactions, right? So it's not just, right? So what is the nature of the interactions, transaction itself, right? Interactions. And I think a little bit of focus on that might help us know to what extent we can make more generalized frameworks, to what extent we cannot, right? Or should not, right? So the nature of the interaction. So I'll come back to this because I have a nice diagram somewhere to show this. After the break, I'll fish that out. But yeah, we'll keep that. But I think this is a good one to discuss, even if we don't have enough time in this session. I hope you guys will do it outside, because I think this is a tricky one. Namrata, please go ahead.
I think, Suraj, a lot of it has been discussed already, but I was just like writing down some points for myself, like, whenever we are working in the field. So you were talking about past experiences. So, they are very important when we are at the designing stage, and we can use that past experience. But then like, whose past experience are we talking about? Because whenever a program is involved, generally, there is not enough brainstorming as an organization. It can be done as an individual or a group of individuals, but then the whole organization coming together for everything, it requires a very nuanced brainstorming. Like, it will take a lot of brains to come at that level. So that is something that I have experienced, that sometimes, because there are a lot of stakes involved. For example, there are funders, we are answerable to certain government official, or maybe there are certain other deadlines to follow. So we are not at that level when we can invest so much into that level of brainstorming. And then this past experience also does not work many a times, because again, as we are talking about, because we are talking about the social and the, like, we are talking about humans. So a person may not be able to respond on the same content given by me, or a same content given by you also, because as and when the individuals are involved, the kind of response to it also kind of impacts a lot. And I think in education or development sector, what I have seen, very personal to me, it can be later talked about, that it cannot be very structured. It is a space which is very spontaneous in nature, and we are responsible to we need to be very responsive to what the people who are involved in the program are behaving in whatever manner. So that is something which I always feel, that how can we actually in such programs, how can we balance that structure versus spontaneity? That is something which I feel is always in my head. And which again, like, brings out the context part. Like, context is again very important thing. And whenever we are, like, doing whatever we are doing, we cannot say that this is leading to that change, because there are lot of things happening at the same time, and this change is not sequential in nature at all. And we are, like, utilizing every opportunity wherever possible to impact it in certain manner. So I was just thinking about all of these things, and and then I came to this only, I think I ask a lot. So this question, that what is the intent of these programs or these interventions? So whenever I am working in a field as an individual, the intent is to bring a change which can sustain for some time. It doesn't matter it has a theory of change or not. It doesn't matter if it is in a sequence or not, and if the funder is happy or not. The change should be meaningful and effective, is what we all are trying to do at Vikramshila.
Agreed. But in order to do that, right, how do we best set ourselves? Can we do it without a theory of change, without a needs assessment? I think, would you go that far to say? I mean, so agreed.
I think I have some
sustained, meaningful change of a certain sort. Oh, we can hear you though.
Yeah, it is on my part. I think I'm, like, the voice is breaking.
Oh, you're not able to hear. Okay.
It is better now. Yes, I can.
Yeah. No, I was just, I don't know if anybody would disagree with your broader point, Namrata, that over-structuring, right, in this kind of field is a little silly. So we need structure, But towards the end, you were almost saying we don't even need structure, so I was just questioning that part. Certainly,
No, I'm
we
not
have to be
saying that we
careful
don't
about
need,
the
I was
kinds
not
of
saying that we are not,
structures within which,
we don't need any structure. Maybe we need a structure to fall
Yeah.
back to, but then we should be like, we are ready to, grab that opportunity of spontaneity. But what I'm saying here is, always like the intent of it. So, for example, Vikram Sheila has been working for like so many years, and intent has always been the bigger thing. And when it comes to, the funders, the intent is very different. The intent is not to bring a change. The intent is to, maybe influence government official. This is also a change, but then, and also to maybe show numbers on their part.
Corporate social responsibility.
Yeah. So it is a very different, like we are not on the same page then. Then if we are not looking for the same thing, we not have the same theory of change or
I think
structures.
I would completely, not say that we don't require structure at all. Like if you ask me to give a percentage of, structure versus flexibility, I would say that, see, 30% of it would be structure and 70% would be flexibility, because that is how the interactions within the field, they're quite dynamic, and it is not going to fall under the purview of your structure, even if you try to mold the data that way. So there has to be an ample scope for flexibility. Yes.
So one way to think about it is there is need for structure. Our discussion of the theory of change was just saying that whatever we put, and it should be flexible, is what many of you are saying. Seema has also put a message in the chat box, right? And I think Naini, you're also almost saying which is more important, right? 70-30, whatever it is, we are agreed. So the theory of change discussion was just to say that whatever planning structure we give in a design should be, we should be able to justify it to ourselves and others as to how that is expected to work, precisely for the reason Naini was saying, which is what are we trying to get at, what you were calling intent, right? So there should be clarity on that, which is the needs assessment part, right? What are we doing this for? What is the ultimate value that we want to kind of work towards? And how does the structure, with all the flexibility which is appropriate, right, justifying how it, so the issue is when we are not able to justify whatever structure we make because of the shelf, because we are not required to, because we are too busy. I think that's where we are. I think yes, Shubhra, I think
structure which allows flexibility. I mean, oxymoron.
I would like to talk in very practical terms about a certain intervention we did. Wipro was the funder, and there was absolutely no kind of, very open, a lot of openness, and it was the madrasa intervention. And because we were asked by the government to modernize the madrasas. Now, modernizing the madrasas can mean 100 different things to 100 people. The principal secretary, when he briefed us, he had an idea. The minister, when he briefed us, he had another idea. And we had no idea. And what we did was we told them very honestly that we have no idea, but we would like to spend 2 to 3 months in the field, just trying to understand what the need was. And then we spoke to the teachers. They had another idea. When we spoke to the managing committee members, they had someone. It was all very different. But finally, from our observation and all these, what we realized that the teachers were the closest. They were on the mark. I mean, when they expressed their needs, and then we designed a program on the basis of that. But then at that time, it was 2007, 8. Quite early on, and we didn't know about the TOC or anything. But now, and listening to you, I feel that a lot of these things had been, processes had been followed kind of intuitively. But since we did not have a theoretical structure, and I think a great learning loss has happened to the organization. because, I would like to go back, and the program underwent so many iterations, I can't tell you, because we were just allowed to follow from the donors end, and from the government end. Also, they gave us freedom, because when we gave them, evidence of our 2-3 months, observation, Kaju, we gave them. Now we call it scoping study, and we have made it a part of our proposals. Because, when we enter something, we first need to understand what it is all about, and the entire program design may change. Because you are basically even something concrete as improving learning outcomes of children. It can be done in 100 different ways. And the way I have been successful in, say, Calcutta may not happen in the madrasas. So there are so many different things. So, so I think we had followed that kind of a path, but now looking and listening to you, that came back to our mind. And since we were not aware, so maybe I was thinking, as when we have a face-to-face workshop, and then there is another project where we went through similar iterations and changes because the donors stepped back. And they allowed us to just understand, read the context. It was a program called Education to Employability, where we were trying to do something for children in high schools, doing something for them that was not there. It was a completely innovative program. And I would give credit to the donor there also, that they gave us a very, free hand and allowed us. And the program went through several iterations. Most of the things were thrown out of the window after 2 years. And, we kind of reinvented and until we found something that, if, I was just thinking aloud that during our face-to-face workshop, if we could take some of these as case studies, and, because it will be very, because we have experienced it. It is in the organization's knowledge, because then the theory where the people are struggling, I can see, to write these theories. Because when I talk to them about these programs, these theories become alive to them. So just we have 2-3 such examples where I think we had followed this theory of change without knowing what we were doing. We were not aware of it. So if we could, then it will be easier for us as an organization to internalize something that we have experienced, and it is in our history.
I'm already wanting to know more of both, especially the modernizing madrasa, given aaj ka mahol. I mean, and I think from what you're saying, this is a useful corrective to point out. Sometimes there is that freedom available from donors. You're talking about government, which is often seen as a very rigid, but so there are all kinds of situations.
No, we had to do certain things to make the government flexible. That was also a strategy. But I think it was all in all a very wonderful, even after all these years, when I look back and see that it was a really good piece of work done, and without that kind of a theoretical structure or network, I think the richness of the program has not been captured. But even now, it is not too late. It is still very relevant. Both the projects that I'm talking about this bridging the gap between education and employability, what we did, what our interpretation was, as against what the corporates were, suggesting, what they were thinking. So
I think, what you're saying,
studies.
First of all, I think we should do it. And I'm also noting down these two for, so that we can follow up in some way. But also, I think this points to something we had discussed at the beginning of the set of sessions, which is most of what we are doing is very commonsensical, right? So there's nothing intimidating or technical when you think about it. So as you're saying, even without all this fancy language and
but this is
you
important.
went through that same exercise, right?
But this is very important. This is very important. Having the theory and the practice together. What I think, I just wish that we had this theory, we had these structures. And talking about structures, the importance, I personally feel that unless you have structures, you cannot be flexible. You need, in order to be flexible, you need a structure. Because flexible vis-a-vis what? Otherwise, it is chaos. I mean, even in a training program, I go with a certain structure in my mind, but then I see this group will not be, then I tweak. But unless I had that structure, the training would have gone either way. I mean,
that's a very important thought. Reminds me, Robert Frost once said, he used to write, as you know, poetry which is very rhyming, and he refused to write open verse and all that. So he was asked why once, and he said in an interview, writing poetry without a rhyme is like playing tennis without a net. And what he meant is, yeah, if you think that that's a constraint, right? Remove the net, let's be free. But it's that seeming constraint which actually allows us to up. So for him, better poetry comes from the seeming constraint of the rhyme, because that's what, you know, so what you're saying, which is sometimes that structure is what allows us, yeah, even if we want to violate a structure, we should have it in order to know, to justify that. And I think that's really comes to this point about a theory of change is not meant to shackle us, but hence we have to go past the logic model, right? That listing doesn't allow us to ask what are the connections, what is our justification to be open to others, you know, changing, right? But only when we lay it out can that discussion happen. Yeah, so in that sense, very much.
I think, Suraj, you know, one of the key takeaways from all the discussion about theory of change has been that it is about those arrows, you know, both those arrows from inputs to outcomes. You see, it is about detailing the process through which we intend to achieve a particular outcome or an output. And that is theory of change, very simply to put it.
Yeah, I would agree. It is our detailed story we tell of how an intervention is expected to play out. A story has to say, right, exactly, ki kya kaise hoga, and yeah, it's really connecting those dots as a set of expectations, which is why if we were to now retrospectively see how things worked out, what is the story which ended up happening for example, the two cases which you mentioned, you know, the modernizing madrasa and the education for employability. I mean, so which we will go through that exercise at the end of our impact evaluation module. We are going to be calling that impact process tracing, which is retrospectively going back and seeing what were the processes through which it worked out. The theory of change is a prospective, right? That is to say, before you do it, right? The story you tell before you enter the story, right? And process tracing is the story you tell looking back on the journey, and both are needed, and they may not coincide. They don't, because reality surprises us, right? So we are still in the design theory of, which is the prospective, that is to say, a story, a structure, and an explanation of the structure, right? So structure by itself, without a justification or an explanation of how we expect things to flow, that really is what it and to be able to do that, there should be clarity, which both Naini and Shubhra were saying. There should be clarity on what is it that we want, right? What is the story, the prospective story expected to lead to, right? So if you leave modernization of madrasas, and lots of people have different views on this, right? Then that story becomes incoherent, and so that story can happen only if there is some kind of goal clarity, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And so that 3-month scoping exercise, which was mentioned, all of that, then, so I mean, we call that needs assessment program choice, right? I mean, that's how we've been building it up in these sessions, but we also know they all go together, right? So theory of change is an expectation leading to an end, for which a consensus has developed. And so before that, if that consensus is not there, or if it's too vague, so that really depends on the context. Like I gave an example, one of the big programs at Vidya Bhavan is a donor has asked us to increase the 10th board pass rate, right? So we find it overly narrow, and we are trying to now, I think but so that's the opposite of modernized madrasa, right? So there is no, it is so narrow, and there's a consensus, but it's a slightly fake consensus, right? Because we're not even asking, why do we want to increase board rate? That we can do by some rattawing some past papers, right? It might have very little to do with learning or other things we care about. So I think there was consensus, but without discussion, right? There was a very narrow consensus. While in this case of 3 months of this madrasa project, creating that. So all of that is part of, or is presupposed to do a theory of change.
Right.
Yeah.
Suraj, you remember in the last session, I asked you a question that at what stage should we actually question our assumptions? So after today's session, I think at the stage of theory of change, because it is just a prospective process of laying it out, I think we should just, be mindful of the assumptions that we are proceeding with. So questioning those assumptions should come at a later stage, right?
So my sense of it is that questioning and that justification should happen at the design stage. B, let us say at some kind of midterm kind of review kind of stage where you see what's happening and we see that we need to tweak. Almost inevitably we do, because we learn the context better when we start doing things, right? So I think there is a useful practical role both at the design stage. I mean, think of BINP, a lot of money and a lot of effort, right? I mean, if they had figured that they identified the wrong target, so to speak, for their nutrition counseling sessions, they found it only in retrospect, right? That would have been useful to question those assumptions, but they just did a off the shelf, right? Copy paste of the Tamil Nadu program into Bangladesh. So there's an example where, yeah, it would have helped to know. I mean, there are some other spectacular such, there was a huge experiment in Karnataka a few years ago to replicate the famous Kerala Panchayat model, Kerala People's Plan model, and so they tried to copy everything that Kerala did in feudal patriarchal North Karnataka, and that was a resounding failure. And then in retrospect, they realized that all the assumptions, Kerala had a particular history, a particular set of caste movements, right? None of that was there. So right now, so we have lots of examples of this sort where, at the design stage, if basic assumptions, basic flow, right? Those arrows, Nani, as you're saying, right? Some justification why one thing leads to the other. If that's not done, I think that's costly in a social sense, right? Of all our efforts. So that's one. And now the question is how best to question it, correct? Yeah. So I'll go on now to a few slides on participatory design, right? So we can get
one last question.
Yeah.
Is it okay to say that theory of change is the structure which we give to a program?
I think that's fair. Yeah. Of course, the word structure is, we have to specify what we mean, but let's say intuitively, if you have a sense, yeah, I think that's one way of describing a theory of change. It's a structure. See, the thing is, logic model also qualifies, right? And I think I would want to make that distinction. But the structure should embed in it the process, the expected processes, right? The story of the future.
Better structure than a log.
Yeah. If by structure we understand that the arrows and the justification for arrows are provided, then I think we can call it that. Normally, when I use that word structure, I don't automatically think of processes embedded in the structure, but if we do, then yes, sure, yeah. But I think revisiting the theory of change somewhere during the rollout is also useful. Right? So I think at 2 points. One is at the design stage, and second is sort of what you were saying yourself, Nani, earlier, that you do kind of a review where you look at once some data comes in and so on, you do some kind of diagnosis of whatever the data is. Even if things are going according to plan, not according to plan, you still want to know, right? So of course, the next question is how do you do it? Can you do it in a very structured with flexibility, right? Now we know that we're talking about not silly structure, a rigid, confining structure, but liberating structure, right? But can we put some kind of flexible structure on that diagnosis stage? I mean, or do you do it just intuitively, right? Because you all sort of know it, kind of thing. And so that could be another discussion to have. How do we create a kind of, like doctors do a triage kind of thing, right? They ask a set of, there's a protocol. It doesn't mean we have to create a checklist. I'm just saying that, can we evolve whatever works for us in terms of, right? How do we, what kind of midterm analysis can we do? And it doesn't have to be some kind of numbers analysis, right? I mean, there are many ways of thinking about it, but both would contribute to theory of change, is my point, right? The design assumptions and the rollout and revisiting assumptions and rollout. I think both would be. Conventionally, theory of change is a design matter, not an implementation matter. Okay. Typically, when people say theory of change, it is before rollout. It's a design. It's purely prospective, but clearly it is helpful for the during as well. Right? Yeah. All right.
5-minute break. You said, Suraj, 5-minute break.
Yeah. I think that's a good. I tend to to often forget. So this is good moment to have our break. When we come back, I'll go a little bit through participatory ways of doing design, program design, but briefly, and then we'll spend a bit more time on implementation now, right? What are the and we'll go back to TAL, take an example and work through implementation. So that's the plan. Let's meet at, I think it's 35 now, right? So we'll meet at 45 minutes. I hope we're all back. Okay, so let me move on and yeah, this is the slide I sort of inserted based on the discussion, led by Seema. What I'll do, I'll very briefly discuss this now, but this was not part of my original plan for today. So, and we'll just send out an email with a couple, 2-3 pages along on this for those who are interested. But this is really picking up on this question of what kind of structure can we put, and are some of the activities in other sectors, can we learn from them for the social sector, for the development sector, right? That discussion, and Seema's example of SBI, I think it's very important to think about this. So this particular diagram is from a book called Building State Capability, which is an interesting book. A lot of examples from education, but it's not about education per se, not about India per se either. But here I'm just picking up one thing. So the authors are Andrews, Pritchett, and Woolcock. The book is Building State Capability. You can get a PDF. It's called Building State Capability. Yeah, you can get the PDF fairly easily online. But anyway, I'll put together a little part of this to circulate for those who are interested, because this might help us in that debate, that mini debate we were having. I'll be brief here for the sake of time. And so what they say through this kind of this diagram is that it's worth identifying the nature of the framework possible, how we should think about implementation and plan for implementation based upon these 4 questions that they have posed at the beginning. The first is the question that I think Seema and Naini were talking about, the nature of the interactions between people, right? How transaction intensive is a program. So does it require many agents to act and coordinate, or few? Not just that, but are those agents very diverse, or are they coherent, right? So there are many things about the nature of the interactions between people. The second is how much discretion is there, for implementing agents. So for example, traditionally the teacher in a classroom was thought to have considerable discretion, right, in how to present, create a learning situation, given the teacher's understanding of the context of the students and so on, right? But increasingly, when we move to, for example, online mass kind of education, right, some of that discretion is cut down, right? People sometimes talk about you don't need teachers anymore because you can sort of pipe in many of these activities without that, right? So you can reduce the discretion, right, and still imagine it. Now, of course, many educationists find it very problematic, but the point is how much discretion is imagined by the people in the activity, right? So the more or less. So think of engineering, right, versus that's why I was taking the example of engineering, but as opposed to some very intensive social mobilization in a community where you can't really, it all emerges right from that experience. You can't really, there's a lot of, spontaneity is a term that many of you were using, right, in that emergence. So, yeah. Third is service or imposition of obligation. Well, in the interest of time, I'm not getting into that. The first 2 are I think, the more obvious ones, which I think some of you touched upon. And the fourth is it based on a known technology or an accepted handbook, right? Is there a manual that the implementers follow, and a manual which puts things, is connected with the idea of discretion again, right? Or do people have to kind of create their very contextual, in this particular classroom or this particular school or this particular village, now we have to create something else because this doesn't fit in a particular imagination, right? So how much of it is just rolling out some very clear thing, and how much of it is so you see where this is leading to, right? The spirit of this is really that it's possible according to them, and they give some examples from health of different kinds of iodine, tablet, distribution, this, that, to say that you can see different kinds of activities within a program as having different degree of transaction intensivity, different degree of local discretion, and so on. Some are more, some are less. Where there is more of these things gets to the spontaneity part, right? Where you can't do too much scaled structure. And so they have some interesting ways of thinking about this, right? In fact, from this whole discussion, like I said, I'm just giving you a flavor of it because I'm not prepared to discuss this at length. But I will circulate a little bit on these lines. I think it's useful because it fits the discussion that Seema and Nani particularly, and many of the others also were having.
The third point, Suraj, that is something we do consider, like all of our programs. Yeah.
So, okay, fair enough. Yeah. So they use these terms. So they use these interesting terms of accountability to distinguish programs based on these kinds of criteria. They call some thin accountability and some thick accountability. So the degree of thickness is when there is more transaction intensity, more interactions, more discretion, and thinness. So engineering, building a house where the geomorphology is well known, right, maybe is thin in this sense, while a certain kind of mobilization task, right, to get people to be more interested in education in a particular setting, might be thicker. So they use this kind of terms, thin, thick, and use these criteria. So it's interesting. And maybe, Seema, this could be one way to think about the question you were posing, right? Are there frameworks? It depends, right? Even within the social sector, there are some relatively thinner activities and some relatively thicker. In fact, in a July workshop I did at Seva Mandir, they tried to distinguish thinness and thickness of their own activities. And it was an interesting task, right? So it's a matter of degree. So, I mean, beyond a point, it becomes a little bit silly. But this idea, I think the spirit is interesting to talk about it. So this could be one. I'll circulate this. And if there is interest, we can come back to it in another session. But this, I think the question is a good one for us to keep thinking about, right? Structure, spontaneity, framework, but flexibility. At Shubra's point, you need a framework in order to then push against it, but then you need to justify, right, where you want to push against it and why. So that's possible only if you have that structure. So I think this is it's stuff that I think we should keep thinking about. But yeah, this is, I think, a useful way of thinking about it. So I'll circulate a little section of this thin, thick accountability stuff. Yamini Iyer, who's worked a lot on education, but now she heads the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. She has tried to argue, for example, in India, using this thick, thin kind of distinction, that some of the rights-based, programs, right, are thinner and some are thicker. And somewhere she says RTI versus RTE, right to information and right to education. If you think both coming out of the rights discourse, but the RTI, the way it's operationalized, she argues, is much thinner because there's a format. You have to ask for some information, put in an RTI request, and the government is supposed to respond in X number of days. And if there isn't, there's a very clearly defined grievance mechanism, and and all that, right? It's set up and it somewhat works also, right? So, but it's all it's not transaction intensive. It's not locally discretionary. There's a certain kind of thinness. While she says the RTE is full of thick activities, when all the elements of it, and so distinguishing thinness, thickness based on these kind of criteria could be useful. This is of course at a broad level, but imagine it even for a particular program you are doing, right? It has multiple activities. Some might have more of these elements, some might have less of these elements, and that understanding might help us know where to give flexibility, where to be more confident in imposing a known structure, right? So that's the context in which I was presenting it. I'm going to move on, but let me just check. Are there any quick questions? There ought to be, because I was very brief, but it just occurred to me from Seema's question. That's why I just put this in. Yeah, so maybe we can have a discussion after we circulate this, maybe for a future session, maybe next session itself. Yeah. Bigger point. This is I think, deep question that we are that has been raised about structure, flexibility, and so on. Okay, moving on. Oops. Oh, I'm on the wrong PowerPoint.
So you handled the spontaneity, Suraj.
No, the reason I could get it in fast was because I was using this, in an APU course I was teaching on development practice. So yeah, that's why I could insert it easily, but then I ended up switching over to that PPT. Yeah, okay. I think we're back to what I wanted. Yeah, that is spontaneity. Or rather, when things go wrong, right? Jugaad. So there's a lot of very interesting discussion, by the way, in anthropology on jugaad. Jugaad as a way of finding ways to enliven structures, because structures, there are lots of interstices, empty spaces, as structures don't work as expected. It's not just India, I mean, anywhere. And so what is the nature of improvisation? Jugaad. Right, spontaneity in service of structure, right? Not to sabotage structure, but actually to make the structure work, you might have to go outside the structure.
Yeah, it proves your agility basically.
Yeah, yeah, but but for the same goal.
Yeah. Positively. Yeah.
Positively in that sense. Yeah. All right. So briefly, a little bit on participatory program design. And I'm guessing that this is, again, territory that would be fairly familiar to many of you. So I just thought, in the interest of completeness, I should mention. And there is a long kind of history of these kinds of participatory techniques, especially in program design. Originally famously, called PRA, Participatory Rural Appraisal. But of course, it can be operationalized anywhere, in urban settings, in schools, wherever. But it was a set of ideas and techniques which went under the name PRA, and that's originally, and then lots of different newer versions, PRRA, PLA, and so on. But the whole idea was to get communities to participate in needs assessment, in program choice, maybe in theory of change itself, right? By community, whatever is the relevant community, right? It could be teachers in a school, it could be students, it could be parents, it could be community leaders, it could be, education experts, ideally all of them, but yeah, so think of it broadly. And there are some well-known PRA techniques. I've just listed them here. Not all might be relevant for the kind of work you might be doing, but mapping, calendarizing, all through participatory ways. And there's a lot of examples of these kinds of things now in India and elsewhere. So these are examples of kind of maps and calendars and so on, made, through participatory ways. And often participatory methods are very helpful in all three elements of design that we've discussed so far: needs assessment, program choice, and theory of change. They may not be used as much in all three. Typically, theory of change is written by people who know this kind of language, English speaking, kind of desk-based, kind of program professionals. But increasingly now we have examples of people, taking draft theories of change, right? Tentative theories of change developed by, let's say, English speaking professionals to the community before it's being rolled out, right, at design stage itself. So I'm just pointing out that very well-known participatory techniques. So I'm sort of assuming it's a world that you're somewhat familiar with, and luckily there's plenty of resources, lots of stuff. So we're not intending to get too much into this in this course. Just pointing out you can easily plug in with existing ways of creating some kind of a participatory way of doing all elements of design. Certainly needs assessment, and it's the most common in needs assessment, I find, but also in program choice and theory of change. So just pointing that out. There are also well-known limitations of these participatory techniques. I've just listed some here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss it too much, but just for the sake of completeness, just reminding ourselves this is there. These techniques are there, have been there for decades, are used in different ways, have been adapted to different situations, to classroom situations, to school situations, to community situations, and well-known misuse also. And nowadays, because everybody thinks they have to say that something was participatory, often PRAs are done kind of namesake. Naam ke vaste PRA is also very common. You just parachute into some community and round up a bunch of people and ask some questions and get some things and make sure you get some women or some particular groups that you've created in your mind as marginalized, right? And it's all sort of very pre-packaged kind of way. I've seen these kinds of PRAs also in action. That's what I'm saying. So because it's become a buzzword, it's good to say, oh, we did a PRA, or we consulted our communities. That often gives us an extra point so it's become a little bit of a game. And so the true participation is a difficult thing to achieve. It needs to really, people to soak in that situation, to create some kind of rapport. It's not possible in a few hours or a day or 2 days. So I'm just pointing out that this is used and misused equally. Yeah. So
Suraj,
yeah.
What did you say the full form of PRA was?
Oh, it's called participatory rural appraisal.
Appraisal.
Yeah. So yeah, if there's so yes, I felt comfortable not getting into it because there's tons of stuff. Yeah. So originally, yeah, it was called participatory rural appraisal, but it doesn't have to be rural. It can be, the ideas can be adapted yeah, it's associated with Robert Chambers at the University of IDS Sussex in the 70s onwards. The whole team at IDS Sussex started developing these and trying these out in the field, especially in India. And now many NGOs do these kinds of things. And then the techniques have evolved. Yeah, but PRA is participatory rural appraisal, and then PLA, learning appraisal, and so on. As with any technique over the decades, it's been adapted. Yeah. So that's
immersing oneself into the context is something that we as economists really hold genres really in high regards for that, for the sort of work that he does to immerse himself in the situations, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. And so building a sense of needs, building a sense of program structure, building a sense of justifying arrows in a theory, right? All of this stuff through that kind. So all I'm saying is these actual techniques are available. So PRA is both a philosophy and a set of techniques I listed a bunch in a previous slide. This needs its own kind of, set of. If there is interest, we can think of building it into this set of sessions. Right now, that is not the plan. It's just to indicate that these things are available and can be used. The focus right now is still on program design. It's just that participatory techniques are available. And yeah, have to be used in a slightly humble manner, because they tend, there's a certain hubris. Oh, I went to the field, right? I got a, so I know, because there's a danger of that, because there's a lot which is invisible, right, within the classroom. We talk about hidden curriculum and hidden, power relations. Gender nowadays and caste is increasingly less visible than in the past, when it was more overt. Now the gendered and casteist processes work, but are subtle, right? And it's possible to sit in and do a classroom observation and think that we didn't see gendering or casteist processes. That's because, yeah, much of it is hidden. And so so these techniques need time, need patience, all that. And so participatory theory of change is what I wanted to get to in the context of what we're discussing here. And so it is possible to sit with different groups of people, in a kind of PRA, the spirit of PRA setting, whatever the setting is, to try to create. And the good thing about theory of change is logic model is more intimidating for people who are not professionals. But theory of change actually is much more intuitive, because it's diagrammatic. Ye hua to wo hua, right? And diagrams are actually more welcoming than listing outputs, outcomes. You don't need any of that kind of fancy language. I've myself seen this, work. I've done it also a bit, but seen this work effectively by good facilitators who are able to work with different groups to see from their experience what is the story which is likely to work out if you try something, in this community, right? It's possible to develop a theory of change and ask people, to explain their arrows, aisa kyon, right? Because we are storytelling creatures, right? And people are used to these kinds of things. So I think there is a lot of scope for doing this participatory theory of change in this sense, right? But again, the point is to get to the world of the arrows and reflecting on the arrows, right? What I've written here, articulating what has to happen for goals to be met and underlying assumptions, right? The other thing, and this term also may be of some limited value, what is called implicit program theory or theory of change. Implicit is simply means that often you may, when you see a program in action and you look at the program documents, you may not see an explicit theory of change of the sort we've been discussing. A visual, of the sort we discuss in TINP, right? Visual representation with arrows and with some justification for arrows. That together is that kind of prospective story, right? With its justification. So often we may not find it because it doesn't mean that there is no theory of change. It's just that it was not laid out explicitly in program documents, such as maybe what Shubhra was saying about that madrasa and that education for employability scheme, right? But when we, so it's often useful to elicit an implicit theory of change, which is to say it's not explicit, and ways to do it partly is to read into the program document, right? And because when anybody proposes a program, they have stories in their mind. it may not be very well fleshed out, but they have, so it's often a useful exercise to look at some of the documents, but also to talk to the people, right? So a session with Shubhra or others, for these particular programs she was mentioning, what was in their minds? How did they imagine it to work? Right? Even if there's no explicit one, could be. So these are ways of eliciting the implicit theory of change. Right? So that's useful to do. And so here's an example. I tried this kind of thing in that workshop I mentioned in Udaipur. I've worked with Seva, so I tried some of these things out there. And so this, idea is not to read all the boxes. I tried to make it small enough so you don't read it, just to give you a sense of. So we had chart papers, we had groups, working on different programs. Each group, had a chart paper and a couple of hours, and they doodled, and they tried various, ways of doing it. And then finally, of course, this is a digitalized, this is a typed version of it. And each group did it. I just picked one just to show you. And so these are people who are actually doing the program. Right. So these are implementers. So this is not pure design, right? This is during rollout. But in each of those cases, they did not have a well fleshed out theory of change, as is common. But there is an implicit theory of change. Some of them are implementers. They did not necessarily design the program themselves, but it was still interesting to ask them how they imagined their program to work. And in fact, those conversations in those groups were quite interesting because not everybody agrees. Right? 3 of us might be running a program together, but we may never have actually discussed the specific arrows. And once we do it, I might, if you, right? Right. And so there were interesting internal learnings within the group. And then, of course, they created some consensus for the sake of delivering, this thing. But so I think these kinds of exercises, this was done only with program staff, right? A good participatory exercise should be done in a broader way, with other stakeholders, whoever is relevant. But this was even with program staff. It was an interesting set of, and it was not obvious. This is just a final result of it, but there were differences. And so I think those are very productive. So I've come to believe that, this kinds of exercise is helpful for clarifying things for ourselves. But the arrow business is crucial, right? As we've been discussing. If you just list out output, there's not much tension. There's not much productive. You just sort of, it's too cut and dry, and it's not story. You can't imagine, right? The rolling out. So hence this. Again, you could still see there's a bit of linearity in this, right? I mean, and I'll give you today some examples of non-linearity or loops, which become important, right? So but again, this is just an example to suggest that there are participatory ways of doing it. Often theories of change are implicit, often useful to make it explicit by eliciting it, by reading into documents, by talking to people, especially in a kind of group format, as in this case, right? So these are useful things. And what I'm realizing is it's also not too time consuming, right? The other thing is, we don't have time, but this kind of exercise is still doable. Now with communities and all, it's a little more, but within our own teams, right, there's a certain familiarity, there's a certain efficiency with which some of these things can be done. But if you were to do this, let's say with teachers and students and so on, that has to be done in a with giving more time. All right, so let me get to
what is OOSC in the previous slide?
Here, is there an OOSC?
But
OOSC,
OOSC.
OOSC is usually out of school children, but is there an OOSC in here?
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same.
In one of their boxes, is it? Oh, the very first box. Yeah. Everything else is Hindi, but they're an OOSC. Yeah.
Naini has read each box so that she's taking.
Can't help it.
Yeah, that's why I was saying the purpose was maybe I should make it, but
Okay,
the
I'm
wood
not
for the
saying
trees
now.
issue, right? I mean, the idea is to see, okay, there's a certain way in which they evolved. Whether or not this is right or wrong is beside the point. This is the story in their minds. Then we can push back on the story. Oh, why do you think this arrow? I mean, what makes you think that it's working this way, right? That's when the interesting conversations happen. When you start asking, why arrows are being drawn in a particular ways and what's the thing. So that's what I wanted to highlight. Yeah. Okay. Implementation. So I'm going to take a little bit of, okay, we have 20 minutes left today to go back to TAL. And I'm going to draw on a particular implementation plan that TAL people have laid out. So I'm drawing, and Dvitiya is the one who pointed me to this, this particular article by Rukmini Banerjee and Madhav Chavan on TAL, where there are a few pages devoted to here is how it works. So I'm going to just first lay out it, and then we will we'll try to analyze what their implementation plan is. Okay. So the way to think about what we are going to be doing now is to think about the first part of the theory of change. Remember the input to output, right, world, which is the world of activities, right? Can we zoom in and see what all is involved? What is the planning? What is the structure? What is the available flexibility? Right, that discussion we had, but for the implementation part, the input to output part, right? So we are now moving there, and next week Dvitiya will take us through more implementation, especially indicators and what are useful ways of measuring these things. Yeah, today I'm taking a slightly broader view by introduction. So so I'm just going to lay out their implementation plan. And just to remind you all, TAL is pretty simple, right? The idea is figure out where each student is in terms of learning level and figure out some teaching learning, which takes them from where they are to wherever you want to take them to, right? That's really teaching at the right level. The title tells you what it's about, right? So for example, have summer camps or have particular, right, times when you get all these students and then you teach them at the right level. So here's the implementation plan. First, assess the learning level of each student, because you need to, the right level, if you remember that video that we saw of Rukmini Banerjee, right, when we were introducing TAL, she says somewhere, what is the right level? TARL. The RL, the right level, is the level of the student. Right. So the first step is to find out where is the level of the student. Simple. So they have some basic assessment tool and so on. It's a one-on-one tool according to this article. Second is make groups of students. Groups are made by levels and not grades or ages. Yeah. So redistribute. So typically our grades are classes are by grades and not levels. So once you know where the levels is, you regroup based on levels. Third is, so once I go through this, then we will start analyzing. I'm just laying it out now. Third is design 3 or 4 activities for each hour, for each group, right? So for each group, there should be a set of activities. And so they say some reason why activities, there should be multiple activities, given the the children and attention and so on. And there they say for scalability, the teaching learning materials should be easily demonstrable and doable, because built into their design implementation plan is scale. Okay. Now one can critique this. We'll come to critiques and analysis, but first just keep your critiques in check, so that we can first get through how they actually plan the implementation. So, so this bullet point I've put here, so they want to make sure that different kinds of teachers can easily fit into this. That's their idea of scale. And so, for example, volunteer teachers in summer camps, regular school teachers, and so on. So a wide body of people should be able to transact this. Therefore, the design of activities should be mindful of that. So that's one of their criteria in this. So TLM should be easily demonstrable. So you should be able to train people easily to use it. So that's one of their explicit criteria. And the second is for scalability, use available resources. So knowing a little bit of context and use of available resources. Pretty commonsensical stuff, but they've done us the service of actually laying it out nicely in this article. That's why it's useful. 4, design progress indicators. Right? Because after all, the activity is a flow, right? Which is these groups, you do these activities over a period of time, over many days, weeks, and so on. And so the 4th part of the plan, implementation plan, is to track progress. Okay. Of course, point number 4 is something that Vidya will talk more about next session, as I mentioned, but this is part of that plan. Right. So far, I think pretty straightforward. And again, in point 4, they emphasize simple measures because after all, teachers are the ones who have to keep track and so on. So again, something which we'll talk more about next session, but so that's one of the criteria for designing progress indicators. Okay, so far so good. Assess learning levels, using that make groups, design activities with scalability in mind, and design progress indicators. Okay. Here on the right, I've put number 5, teaching learning activities. For example, regular class with a few activities, right? Could be a little bit of lecture oriented, some blackboard stuff, some whatever, right? Some conventional and other things. So I'm just calling it TLA, but it's by group. Remember, it's not by grade, but by group, which is based on level. And 6th is track progress, and they do it both at the individual level and at the group level as well. Okay, so this is sort of it. And the reason I've put 1, 2, 3, 4 on the left and 5, 6, they don't make this distinction in the paper, but as I was reading it and trying to digest it for myself, I'm making this distinction. The ones on the 4 are sort of somewhat one-time activities, right? You first assess learning, you create your group, you design your activities, and you design indicators. The ones on the right are the real flow, right? Which are the actual activities being implemented, right? On the left is the design, creating these things. So on the right, I've just put the TLA, which are the actual activities, which is a flow, which is session by session by session, it flows. And number 6 is also a flow. It's an activity which is tracking progress. It need not be session by session, but it is certainly a flow, right? While the ones on the left are mostly one time. I'm saying mostly because all assumptions need to be revisited, but first pass, mostly you do these things, then so normally when we think of implementation, we think of, let's make sure we do all these, get our groups, get our activities, get everything, then we are ready to go. What is the going part? Actually running the classes and seeing, right, kids progress, right? So naturally, the stuff on the left is the everyday kind of flow. The others come at discrete, maybe one time or at discrete intervals. So far, so good. Now, what I want to do is now to really analyze this, right? So this is just the basic. And now I've just put it into what appears to be linear, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is, by the way, if you read their article, they've put it like that. And so now, right, so assess levels, using levels, make groups, design activities for group, design indicate progress for group, And then 5 and 6 actually implement the activities and implement the tracking, right? And the way they've written it up, it makes it very linear. And I was thinking, let's complicate it. I mean, based on our understanding of things, not complicated for the sake of it, but let's see, it is a bit too neat. So hence my question in the title here, feedback loops. Are there, can you imagine what are the likely feedback loops, right? Which kind of take away from this simple linearity, which I'm sure they will also agree with. They just lay this out, but they didn't actually discuss the loops so much. So I thought this will be a useful exercise for us. So what would be the loops among these? So yes, Nani, yeah, please.
I think I hogged too much of the talking time on the sessions. So one feedback loop would be that the track progress or the progress indicators would actually take us back to the stage 3, where we are designing activities for each group. So this is one loop, which I think this is also something that we do tend to practice, that if in case, a particular TLM is, say, not working with the students, we track the progress, we know the TLM is not working. So we go back and we redesign the TLM and then we take it back to the field.
Okay.
This is one feedback loop.
Great.
Another would, take you back to level 2 as well.
Level 2 for the grouping. That is after the teaching learning by group, tracking progress, and you go back to the groups again.
Great.
And also 5 also, because when you're tracking the progress and then there is no improvement and something, then you can also teaching learning process can be different.
Okay, I'm going to take Riti's first because that's the way I've ordered my slides. So so it makes it
Can
easier.
we add a 0 level also to it? I think the precursor to all of this process would be defining what a level is.
Yeah, so assess level, so they have some tool, right? To do it, and we know now they have the ASR subsequently, but so, and there's a lot of critiques of these, is good, bad, but they have some way, but that has to be done, right? So in one, so maybe you could make it a 0, or you could have 1A, 1B. Each of these needs to be unpacked, let us say, right? So so I agree with Seema's point that, in number 1, which is assess levels, you have to have some clear benchmark or some clear articulation, right, of categories, right? Suppose even if you did ASR, let's for the time being think that's reasonable, right? Some kind of language skill and mathematical skill, right? And but that the scores are a bit continuous, right? Now from ASR, well, actually ASR, no, poor, medium, high, reading ability, something. So you are making categories, correct? And so those with quote unquote poor, language skills based on that kind of reading and comprehension thing will be one group, and so on. But that still begs the question, as you're pointing out, right? How do you know? How do you, where do you draw the line and say these are in one category? I think that's your point, right? Yeah, and that needs to be settled. That's assumed to be so. So that needs to be done. So right now I'm still looking at loops between them, but you're absolutely right that even within each we need to dig deeper and do all that, right? So fair enough. But going back to the loops, so we'll come back to the ones that were already mentioned. One was connecting 6 with 3, one was connecting 6 with 2. I'm going for, well, since Riti conveniently mentioned this, and that's the way I've set it up. So just for my own convenience, we will, so the closest one is between 5 and 6, right? We'll come to how 6 affects other things too. But at least in my mind, the more immediate thing is 6 affecting 5. At least that's how I set it up, because I'm imagining I'm teaching on a regular basis, right? Having these activities, meeting these students regularly, let's say every day over a whole summer, right? In intensive camp. And so I'm tracking progress. I could do it informally, right? Just body language in class, but also I have formal measures of progress. And I could even without any big redesign, I could still tailor make. Yeah, today I'll spend 10 more minutes on this from yesterday's thing. I realized that, right, I need to do a little more, or let me bring something in, right, as I did with thick and thin accountability, right? That's based on something we discussed, right? That's natural in any teaching situation, right? We adjust as we go along. So that's kind of the more everyday kind of adjustment based on tracking progress, which any teacher automatically does, sometimes not so consciously even, right? Sometimes a little more systematically and consciously, but either way, right? So there is a loop. And so this idea that 5 and then 6 is insufficient because 5 is an influence by 6, right? That's the, right. I hope that this is intuitive, right? So there's this loop. Yeah, let me, so I'll come back to the 2 other loops which are mentioned, which is 6 to 3 and 6 to 2. What about looping 5 with something else? So, right, after all the tracking progress, ultimately, I mean, the crux of it is number 5, correct? The
5 to 2.
5 to 3,
5 to 2.
5 to 2, because teaching learning, if you get your groups wrong, yeah. So 5 to 2 is only via 6, correct?
Yes.
Because you need to, you might need to redesign your, oh no, I got my groups
5
a bit
to
wrong.
3.
5 to 3, yes. 5 to 3, yes. Okay, good.
Wouldn't designs come earlier?
Next.
Like, wouldn't the design the assessment, as Seema said, design the activities, design the progress indicators come as 1, 2, 3, and then probably do the assessment, make the groups, and then TLA by groups and track progress again, maybe make the groups again.
Yeah.
So I think the 3 designs should come, and then.
So you're saying that from 6, you loop back to, well, 6 is very similar to 1, correct?
Yes.
You think of 1 as a kind of baseline,
Yes.
the usual language that we have to jump through. As you can see, I have a little problem with that language, but yeah, that kind of baseline logic is number 1. End line logic, maybe midline or end line is 6.
Periodic, yeah.
And that loops back, correct? That which creates a new cycle, right? So that's one way to think about it.
But then every time they don't need to design new activities, right?
Yeah.
Or design
Correct. So the second cycle could go from 6 to 1 to 5, 6, right? Because these are, as I also suggested, these are sort of, no, it has to go to 2. 3 and 4 are right at maybe one time, right? Or occasionally you might redesign. But so just to understand what Namrata is saying, okay, you got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then from 6, as your cycle progresses, you go to 1 and 2, and then 5, 6. You don't need to do 3 and 4 every cycle once you do it first time. I think, right? I mean, is that fair? So there's that loop. So here we are talking about a loop across cycles, right? Meaning you're talking about cycles, correct? Within each cycle, though, it's still linear, right? So what we are saying is, within a cycle, we can think of non-linearity loop. This is within a cycle. Before even you reassess everything and remake groups, that's a kind of bigger, right, structural change in your program. This is a more continuous kind of looping. All right. Then I think, as one of you said already, 3 to 5, right? After all, once teaching learning activities are happening on an everyday basis, some discoveries might be made. Oh, this activity is just not working. We need to go back to the drawing board, as opposed to a little bit of tweak, right? So when we say design, we're talking about a kind of, it's not a continuous thing, right? It's a something big enough to call it as a change, curricular change, right? So there is a 3 to 5 loop which can happen, which need not always happen. Suppose, things are going well enough that you don't feel the need to substantially redesign, on the other hand, right? So there's a potential loop here between 3 and 5, but it goes via 6. correct? How do I know that my TLA is not working and needs redesigning of activities? Only because I'm tracking progress, correct? So in a sense, maybe it's more correct to say 5, 6, that combo is looped with 3. Even though right now here I've put 3 and 5, partly because...
May not be, right? You would not, it could be just an observational thing. It might not be, you go and assess the progress of the child.
Observation is also kind of an assessment, no, Seema? That observation is also an assessment.
Yeah, so it depends on how...
Say while you are, doing the activity and the teacher feels that this is just not working. So you are not doing the progress tracking of the child over there. So you can just look back and redesign the activity.
Yeah, so that, which is sort of what Seema is saying also was what I had in mind when I put this, but that's why, but I sneaked in 6 because I thought without an element of 6, this is not quite possible. Some element may not be formal, but there has to be some feedback to know, theek nahi hai, thoda isko change karna hai, right? It could be informal feedback, in which case we are not fully in 6, but there's still some element of 6 which comes in. So I put 3, 5, 6, but it's, yeah, so we can decide, but yeah, but there is a loop there. There is also a loop between 4 and 6, which is something we will discuss next session as well, right? Designing progress indicators and then implementing them, right? Tracking progress. Often we realize this is not, we need to track something else, right? Or track it differently. We need to change our indicators. So sometimes it is, right, in the process, the metaphor is always often given, fixing an airplane mid-air, right? You don't have the luxury of bringing it down, and then so as you're flying, you're all something that kind of that's a very kind of realistic program scenario. So so there's a 4 to 6 loop. Then, as I think was already mentioned, there is a 2 through 6. I've put 2 through 6, but you can thread a few more. My thinking, I think one of you already has mentioned it, is once you start tracking progress, imagine it's a 2-month summer camp, and you see that in the first few weeks, some kids are, making progress very differently from others, right? So their levels are actually changing. Then you might need to redo your groups, right? Because your right level has changed, and you want to teach at the right level. So which means your groups might change, right? So that's a bigger, slightly structural change. This is not something which is on an everyday basis, right? Things accumulate to a point where you might need to revisit some of these activities. Yeah, right. I think we are out of time, but let me quickly ask any other loops. And I think I didn't give enough time. I'm sure you can think of more loops. But I hope you're getting a sense of how we can read into an implementation plan, even a simple looking implementation plan, and see connections besides the kind of connection Seema was talking about, which is, detailing each of these is itself an important task. But here I was focusing more on across each. The detailing of each is sort of a more micro activity, very important, which is the task of next session. Here, the kind of broader activity would be across the various activities, right? These kinds of loops. Yeah. So any other quickly from anybody? I mean, I think if we spend more time on it, we can come up with these things more. And notice we are saying these things without knowing the context in which TAL is being operationalized, right? Initially, they did it in Bombay, urban Bombay, then they did it in rural Bihar. So now we have to think of, surely context should rear its head somewhere in an implementation plan. Otherwise, it looks odd, right? Whatever the context, I've got a nice plan. I'm just going to roll it out everywhere, which is what TINP did in Bangladesh, right? And found problematic, right? So what part of the plan needs revisiting based on context also becomes a question. Of course, that then we need to have, that's something I think you folks will find it easier because you're all familiar with particular context you're working in, and that would be an exercise worth doing, right? identify two very different contexts you're working in and see how does that matter for your implementation plan of an otherwise similar program. Because many programs we do run across states, right, in multiple, in very different contexts. Surely it's a problem if we just have one, here's our theory of change. It doesn't matter whether it's Nagaland or Tamil Nadu. Well, it should matter, right? So how does it matter then become? So both in a theory of change as well as, yes, we are discussing here is one part of a theory of change, right? The input to output, right, part of it. So whenever we think of stories, we have to think of how context affects our stories. Here we are thinking of a story of implementation, and therefore my point is context should rear its head, even though so far we have discussed it. Interestingly, if you read their article, the context is also not present, because I think hence all the emphasis on scalability. Now those are positions we take, right? I think theirs is an approach which believes that you can, many of these things can be rolled across contexts. All right, we are out of time, and I think we should stop. Let's see. So this could be a good point to come back to when we begin next week. Yeah, but so maybe I'll take the first few minutes next week to complete this discussion of loops. And then next week we'll be moving a little more into the nitty-gritty of indicators, right? What are appropriate and less appropriate indicators. Yeah, since this particular set of slides is useful for you to think, we'll circulate this material. Namrata, I think your request in the chat box. Yeah. So the request to all of you is, we are still it is still useful to think of those arrows and those justifications. So if you do get time between now and our next session, request is for you to try to go back and see how much refinement you can put into. Most of you are still with the logic model aspect, right? Do try pushing yourself. And the second is, think of, for whatever you picked for your logic model for that exercise, think of the implementation plan. Which I think, Namrata, if I remember, your first theory of change was focusing on that, right? I think you focused a lot on activities. I think your second one, you filled it out, right? So now the request is, since now we are talking about implementation, to go back to it. And so two requests. One is kind of pending from last two, right? Which is go back to finessing your theory of change by arrows and justifications or assumptions, right? And second is sort of what we have discussed in the last half hour, which is for whatever you picked. Some of you picked teachers are not capable, or whatever, social structure as an impact. Whatever you picked for your logic model, can you, in the way in which we tried to do it for TAL right now, what are the key things, and is it linear? What are the loops, right? So it is. So just to remind you, it is still part of the theory of change, right? It's the implementation part of the theory of change. Yeah.
Suraj, we had a question from Shubhradi in the chat box where whether, how is right level different from a typical remedial program or a bridging program?
Yeah, so I think it's very much like that. The philosophy is to emphasize the right level. I think the philosophy of remedial programs is also saying that students, so I think the way I read TAL, it's very similar. And I don't think they're also saying that this is some totally different kind of thing. They're just putting a particular articulation to it. So yes, I think it is similar to our ideas of identifying particular groups of kids, right? Now, remedial, of course, is only for, let us say, quote unquote, lagging. But teaching at the right level could be, for kids who are doing particularly well, for their level, how do you build on them, right? So maybe one way to think is generalizing the idea of behind remedial. Right, would be one way of thinking about right level. But it is very.
Was it targeted for at students who are at a higher level also, or maybe they did not find anything?
Yeah, yeah. So I think they end up doing
have been
more
students
of.
Who would have been beyond that level, right?
Yeah, yeah. I know some versions of it, they do identify kids who are really kind of this thing and give them a little more separate projects to do. I've heard. I don't know how systematic it is as part of TAL, but in principle, all levels. But I think in practice, they focus on levels which don't
Lower
meet
ones.
certain benchmarks.
What's called a gifted program outside.
Gifted,
right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think DPS once upon a time used to have very harsh ability and disability section or something. They had very, very bold, crude titles long ago. I don't know. I hope they have, but something like that. They just one section and another section. I mean, it triggers a lot of psychological kind of responses. But yeah, basically something like this. Yeah. So all of this is, I think, consistent with TAL, the remedial, the gifted kind of thing. All right. I don't want to keep you all too much. So is there clarity on what's expected? At the end of the day, the arrow business, as Naini put it, that's it. Right? That's where now just start complicating the arrows. It's not a simple linear arrow. Arrows go here, there, but you need to justify. That's the challenge.
Okay. Thank you, Suraj.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Suraj, for a good session again. And yeah, hope to see you all next week.
Yes, exactly. We'll all be there and we'll circulate some of this stuff.
Yeah, please do.
So,
Please do. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.